I'm Lisa Martinez, 34, and at my husband David's 10-year work anniversary dinner, his boss Bob Harrison looked me up and down in my carefully chosen dress and said, "You really don't fit in with our company culture, do you?" What he didn't know was that I had the direct phone number of the woman who controlled his biggest government contract worth $40 million. The look on his face when federal agents walked into his office 3 days later still makes me smile. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Meridian Tech Solutions Anniversary Gala was supposed to be David's night. 10 years of dedication, countless overtime hours, and unwavering loyalty to a company that specialized in government software systems. As his wife, I was genuinely proud of what he'd accomplished, climbing from junior programmer to senior systems analyst at one of Phoenix's most respected tech firms. David had worked tirelessly to reach this milestone, often missing family dinners and weekend soccer games with our kids, Emma and Jake, to meet impossible deadlines and exceed every expectation his supervisors set for him. I'd spent weeks preparing for this evening, understanding how much it meant to David to have his family there as he received recognition for his decade of service. The invitation specified cocktail attire, so I'd invested in a sophisticated navy blue dress that was both elegant and appropriate, not too flashy, not too conservative, exactly the kind of outfit that would blend seamlessly with the corporate crowd while making David proud to have me by his side. I'd even gotten my hair professionally styled that afternoon, wanting everything to be perfect for his special moment. The Grand Phoenician ballroom was decorated beautifully, with soft lighting and elegant centerpieces that created an atmosphere of celebration and success. Corporate banners displaying Meridian's logo hung from the ceiling, and a presentation screen showed a slideshow of company achievements over the years. I recognized several faces from David's work stories, colleagues he'd collaborated with on major projects, supervisors who'd mentored him during his early years, and newer employees who looked up to him as a seasoned professional. David introduced me to his coworkers with obvious pride, his hand resting gently on my back as he shared stories about our family and my own professional background. Before becoming a stay-at-home mom, I'd worked as a marketing executive for a defense contracting firm, managing relationships with government procurement officers and overseeing multi-million-dollar campaign strategies. It was demanding work that required deep understanding of federal regulations and military requirements, but I'd thrived in that environment until Emma was born and we decided I should focus on raising our children. The evening progressed smoothly through cocktails and dinner, with David receiving congratulations from colleagues and sharing laughs about memorable projects and office adventures. I felt comfortable among these people, contributing to conversations about industry trends and sharing appropriate anecdotes about the challenges of balancing family life with demanding careers. Several wives approached me throughout the evening, complimenting my dress and expressing how nice it was to finally meet the woman behind David's frequent family stories. Everything changed when Bob Harrison approached our table during dessert. As David's direct supervisor and the vice president of operations, Bob wielded considerable influence within Meridian's hierarchy. He was known for his brusque management style and his tendency to make snap judgments about people based on superficial observations. David had mentioned Bob's quirks over the years, describing him as someone who valued appearances and social connections as much as technical competence. Bob had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, his face flushed and his voice slightly louder than appropriate for the elegant setting. He'd been making rounds among the tables, offering congratulations and reinforcing his position as the department's undisputed leader. When he reached our table, he shook David's hand enthusiastically and launched into a speech about dedication and company loyalty that seemed rehearsed and impersonal. Then his attention turned to me, his eyes scanning my appearance with an expression that made me immediately uncomfortable. There was something calculating in his gaze, as if he was assessing my worth based on criteria I couldn't understand. His smile never reached his eyes as he extended his hand for what should have been a polite introduction to the spouse of one of his most valued employees. "So you're David's wife," he said, his tone carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "I've heard so much about you over the years. David's always talking about his family, showing pictures of the kids, mentioning how you handle everything at home while he's here working late." The conversation felt stilted and uncomfortable, but I maintained my composure, thanking him for David's opportunities and expressing appreciation for the company's family-friendly policies. I mentioned how proud I was of David's achievements and how much I admired the collaborative culture he'd described at Meridian. Bob nodded along, but his expression suggested he was forming opinions that had nothing to do with my actual words. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, Bob's mask began to slip. Perhaps it was the alcohol, or maybe he simply felt emboldened by his position of authority, but his comments became increasingly pointed and inappropriate. He made subtle digs about corporate wives and their understanding of business realities, suggesting that some people were naturally suited for professional environments while others were better suited for different roles. The conversation reached its breaking point when Bob looked me up and down with obvious disdain, his expression shifting from forced politeness to something approaching contempt. His voice carried just enough volume for nearby tables to overhear as he delivered the words that would ultimately destroy his career and transform my relationship with confrontation forever. "You really don't fit in with our company culture, do you?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I mean, David's a great employee, don't get me wrong, but looking at you I can see why he sometimes struggles with the more sophisticated aspects of client relations. We need wives who can represent the company appropriately at industry events, you know. Women who understand the corporate world and can hold their own in high-level conversations." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they contained any truth but because of their calculated cruelty and public delivery. Around us, conversations had quieted as people sensed the tension and turned their attention to our table. David's face had gone white with shock and embarrassment, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what his
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Supervisor had just said to his wife in front of their colleagues. The humiliation was complete and intentional. Bob had chosen this moment, this venue, and this audience to deliver a message that had nothing to do with my appearance or behavior and everything to do with asserting his dominance over David through the degradation of his family. It was a power play designed to remind David of his place in the corporate hierarchy and to establish Bob's authority over every aspect of his employees' lives. But Bob Harrison had made a critical error in judgment. He'd looked at me and seen only what he expected to see, a suburban housewife who could be dismissed and humiliated without consequence. He saw someone who would absorb his cruelty in silence, perhaps cry quietly in the bathroom, and certainly never pose any threat to his position or authority. He'd assessed my value based on outdated stereotypes and his own limited understanding of what power actually looks like. What Bob didn't know was that my previous career in defense contracting had connected me with some of the most influential people in government procurement. My former boss, Jennifer Walsh, had been promoted to Deputy Director of Federal Acquisition Programs, a position that gave her oversight of hundreds of millions of dollars in government contracts. Jen and I had maintained our friendship over the years, sharing coffee dates when her schedule permitted and staying connected through social media and holiday cards. More importantly, Bob was completely unaware that Meridian Tech Solutions' primary revenue source was a series of government contracts worth over $40 million annually. These contracts required strict compliance with federal regulations regarding workplace discrimination, hostile work environments, and executive conduct. Companies holding these contracts were subject to regular audits and could lose their government business overnight if violations were discovered. As Bob walked away from our table, clearly satisfied with his public humiliation of David's wife, I felt something shift inside me. The embarrassment and shock were quickly replaced by a cold, calculating anger that reminded me of my former professional self. This wasn't just about defending my dignity anymore, it was about protecting my husband's career from a supervisor who clearly viewed him as expendable and our family as collateral damage in his power games. David reached for my hand under the table, his palm sweaty with anxiety and embarrassment. "Lisa, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I had no idea he would say something like that. We can leave right now if you want. I'll talk to HR on Monday morning." But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I needed to observe Bob's behavior for the rest of the evening, to document his interactions with other employees and their families, to understand the full scope of his misconduct. If I was going to make that phone call to Jennifer, I needed to be absolutely certain that I had a complete picture of the hostile environment Bob was creating at Meridian. Throughout the remainder of the evening, I watched Bob continue his rounds, noting how he interacted with different employees based on their perceived status within the company hierarchy. His behavior toward newer employees was dismissive and condescending, while his treatment of senior staff bordered on obsequious. Most telling was his interaction with the wives of other employees. I observed him making inappropriate comments about appearance and suitability that suggested tonight's treatment of me was part of a larger pattern of discriminatory behavior. When the evening finally ended and we returned home to relieve our babysitter, David was visibly distraught about what had happened. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, apologizing repeatedly for his boss's behavior and expressing concern about potential retaliation if I filed any kind of formal complaint. His distress was heartbreaking to witness. Here was a man who dedicated a decade of his life to a company, only to watch his supervisor publicly humiliate his wife as some kind of twisted power demonstration. "I can handle Bob," I told David as I made us both coffee, my mind already formulating the strategy I would implement the following morning. "You don't need to worry about protecting me from him. In fact, I think it's time Bob Harrison learned exactly who he was dealing with when he decided to insult our family." That night, I lay awake planning my approach. Jennifer Walsh wasn't just a former colleague, she was someone who took workplace discrimination seriously and had the authority to initiate investigations that could fundamentally alter Meridian's business prospects. But I needed to be strategic about this. A casual complaint from a hurt wife wouldn't carry the same weight as a detailed report of systematic discriminatory behavior from someone with professional credibility in the defense contracting world. The next morning, I began gathering information. I researched Meridian's government contracts, identifying the specific agencies they worked with and the compliance requirements those contracts entailed. I reviewed federal regulations regarding hostile work environments and documented everything I could remember about Bob's behavior and comments from the previous evening. I also reached out to Maria Santos, my best friend who had attended the anniversary dinner with her husband Tom Bradley, another Meridian employee. Maria confirmed that she'd witnessed Bob's comments and had been shocked by their inappropriate nature. More importantly, she revealed that Tom had mentioned similar incidents over the years, describing Bob as someone who frequently made disparaging remarks about employees' families and used personal information as leverage in workplace disputes. This pattern of behavior suggested that my experience was part of a larger culture of discrimination and harassment that Bob had been cultivating for years. Armed with this information, I made the call that would change everything. Jennifer answered on the second ring, her voice warm with genuine pleasure at hearing from me after several months. We caught up briefly on family news and career developments before I transitioned to the reason for my call. "Jen, I need to discuss something serious with you regarding workplace discrimination at a government contractor," I said, my tone shifting to the professional register we'd used during our collaboration years earlier. "I believe there may be systematic violations of federal compliance requirements that affect contracts under your oversight." Jennifer's demeanor immediately became more focused and attentive. As Deputy Director of Federal Acquisition Programs, she was responsible for ensuring that government contractors maintained appropriate workplace standards and complied with all relevant regulations. Discriminatory behavior by executives at contractor companies was exactly the kind of issue that fell under her jurisdiction and could result in immediate contract suspension pending investigation. I provided Jennifer with a detailed account of Bob's behavior, not just toward me but the pattern of discriminatory treatment I'd observed and the additional incidents Maria had shared. I emphasized that this wasn't about personal revenge but about ensuring that companies receiving federal contracts maintain the professional standards required by their agreements with the government. Jennifer listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific incidents and Bob's position within Meridian's hierarchy. When I finished my account, she was quiet for several moments before responding with the measured tone of someone who understood the serious implications of what she'd just heard. "Lisa, what you're describing constitutes a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that violates multiple federal compliance requirements for government contractors," she said. "Companies holding contracts like Meridian's are required to maintain harassment-free work environments and ensure that executive behavior meets federal standards. Based on what you've told me, I'm going to initiate an immediate investigation." The investigation began within 24 hours. Federal compliance officers arrived at Meridian's offices without warning, presenting documentation that required immediate cooperation and access to personnel records, complaint files, and executive communication logs. The audit team interviewed employees, reviewed internal communications, and examined the company's compliance training records and harassment reporting procedures. Bob Harrison's reaction to the federal investigation was everything I'd hoped for and more. According to David, who watched the entire drama unfold from his cubicle, Bob emerged from his first interview with investigators looking pale and shaken. The confident, domineering executive who'd humiliated me at the anniversary dinner had been replaced by someone who clearly understood that his career was in serious jeopardy. The investigation revealed what I'd suspected: Bob's behavior toward me was part of a systematic pattern of discrimination and harassment that had been ongoing for years. Multiple employees came forward with accounts of inappropriate comments, discriminatory treatment, and hostile behavior that Bob had directed toward them and their families. The investigators also discovered that several formal complaints had been filed against Bob over the years, but had been buried by an HR department that seemed more interested in protecting executives than addressing legitimate grievances. Within a week of the investigation's initiation, Meridian's CEO Michael Thompson called an emergency meeting to address what he described as serious compliance violations that threaten our government contracts and company reputation. Bob Harrison was placed on immediate administrative leave pending the completion of the federal investigation, and Thompson announced the implementation of new training programs and reporting procedures designed to prevent future incidents. The most satisfying moment came when David called me from work 3 days after the investigation began. Bob had been summoned to what he thought was a routine meeting with Thompson, only to find himself facing a panel that included the CEO, the head of HR, the company's legal counsel, and the lead federal investigator. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes, ending with Bob's immediate termination for cause and the announcement that Meridian was cooperating fully with the ongoing federal investigation. "Lisa, you should have seen his face," David said, his voice filled with a mixture of amazement and vindication. He went from his usual arrogant swagger to complete shock in about 30 seconds. When Thompson announced his termination, Bob actually asked if this was about his comments at the anniversary dinner. Thompson told him it was about years of discriminatory behavior that had finally caught up with him. But the consequences for Bob Harrison extended far beyond losing his job at Meridian. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of discriminatory practices that potentially violated civil rights laws, opening Bob to personal liability and career-ending reputation damage. Word of his termination spread quickly through Phoenix's tight-knit tech community, making it virtually impossible for him to find comparable employment at other firms holding government contracts. More satisfying than Bob's professional downfall was the transformation it created within Meridian's corporate culture. Thompson implemented comprehensive sensitivity training for all executives and supervisors, established clear protocols for reporting discriminatory behavior, and appointed a new VP of operations, who prioritized creating an inclusive, respectful workplace environment. David found himself working for a company that finally lived up to the family-friendly values it claimed to embrace. The experience taught me that sometimes the most effective response to humiliation and discrimination isn't silence or formal complaints through traditional channels, but strategic action that addresses the root cause of the problem. Bob Harrison had tried to use his position of power to diminish and embarrass me, not realizing that his actions would ultimately lead to the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. 6 months later, David received a promotion to team leader, partly in recognition of his technical skills but also as part of Meridian's effort to promote employees who embodied the company's renewed commitment to professionalism and respect. The anniversary dinner that was supposed to celebrate his first decade with the company had actually launched the next phase of his career under leadership that valued both professional competence and human dignity. As for me, the experience reminded me that stepping away from the corporate world to focus on raising my children didn't mean abandoning the skills, knowledge, and relationships I developed during my professional career. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination comes not from the person being targeted but from someone who understands how to leverage existing systems and relationships to create meaningful change. The woman Bob Harrison dismissed as someone who didn't fit in with corporate culture turned out to be exactly the person who could hold him accountable for his discriminatory behavior. His assumption that I was powerless and insignificant became the foundation of his own professional destruction, proving that underestimating people based on superficial judgments is not just morally wrong but strategically foolish. Today, when I think about that anniversary dinner and Bob's contemptuous comment about my failure to fit in with Meridian's corporate culture, I smile knowing that his definition of appropriate corporate culture included discrimination, harassment, and the abuse of power over employees and their families. I'm proud that I didn't fit in with that culture, and I'm even prouder that my one phone call helped ensure that Meridian's corporate culture evolved into something worthy of David's decade of dedication and loyalty. Growing up in a middle-class family in Tucson, I'd always been the type of person who believed in working hard and treating others with respect. My parents, both teachers, instilled in me the values of integrity and perseverance that would later serve me well in both my professional and personal life. I'd earned my marketing degree from Arizona State University while working part-time jobs to help pay for tuition, and after graduation, I'd landed my dream position with Patriot Defense Solutions, a mid-sized contractor specializing in military communication systems. Those early years in defense contracting were exhilarating and challenging in ways I'd never anticipated. The work required understanding complex federal regulations, managing relationships with procurement officers who controlled budgets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and developing marketing strategies that could navigate the intricate world of government contracting. I thrived in that environment, quickly earning recognition for my ability to translate technical capabilities into compelling proposals that won contracts and built lasting partnerships with military decision-makers. My mentor during those formative years was Jennifer Walsh, a brilliant woman who'd risen through the ranks to become one of the youngest senior procurement officers in the Defense Department's acquisition division. Jen saw potential in me that I hadn't recognized in myself, giving me opportunities to work on high-level projects and introducing me to the network of professionals who controlled the flow of government contracts. Under her guidance, I learned not just the mechanics of defense marketing but the subtle art of building relationships that could withstand political changes and budget fluctuations. When Jen was promoted to Deputy Director of Federal Acquisition Programs, she made sure to maintain our professional relationship even as our day-to-day collaboration ended. We'd meet for coffee whenever her schedule permitted, discussing industry trends and sharing insights about the evolving landscape of government contracting. Even after I left Patriot Defense to focus on raising Emma and Jake, Jen and I stayed connected, our friendship deepening beyond its professional origins to encompass the kind of mutual respect and trust that forms the foundation of lifelong relationships. My decision to step away from the corporate world hadn't been easy, but it felt right for our family. David's career at Meridian was demanding and rewarding, requiring frequent travel and long hours that made it difficult for both of us to maintain full-time professional commitments while providing the attention and stability our children needed. We'd made the choice together, recognizing that my marketing background and professional network would always be there when the time came to re-enter the workforce, but that Emma and Jake's childhood years were precious and irreplaceable. The transition from high-powered marketing executive to stay-at-home mom had its challenges, but I'd found ways to stay intellectually engaged while prioritizing my family's needs. I volunteered with the school district's fundraising committee, applying my campaign development skills to help raise money for educational programs. I'd also taken a part-time position at Desert Ridge Shopping Center's customer service department, work that kept me connected to the professional world while allowing flexibility for school events and family obligations. David and I had met during my final year at Patriot Defense, introduced by mutual friends at a barbecue that celebrated the successful completion of a major contract. He was working as a junior systems analyst at Meridian at the time, still learning the intricacies of government software development but already demonstrating the technical aptitude and work ethic that would define his career. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and complementary strengths that made us effective partners both personally and professionally. What attracted me most to David was his integrity and his genuine kindness toward everyone he encountered, regardless of their position or status. He treated waitresses and CEOs with the same courtesy, listened carefully to other people's perspectives, and approached challenges with a methodical thoughtfulness that I found both reassuring and attractive. He was ambitious without being ruthless, confident without being arrogant, and devoted to building something meaningful rather than simply advancing his own interests. Our wedding had been a modest affair, attended by family and close friends who celebrated not just our commitment to each other but the partnership we represented. David's colleagues from Meridian had been warm and welcoming, sharing stories about his reputation for reliability and technical excellence. My former coworkers from Patriot Defense had expressed confidence that our marriage would thrive because we understood and respected each other's professional commitments while maintaining clear priorities about what mattered most. The early years of our marriage coincided with David's steady advancement at Meridian Tech Solutions. He joined the company as part of their expansion into government contracting, bringing fresh perspective and technical skills to projects that required innovative approaches to complex software challenges. His supervisors quickly recognized his potential, assigning him to increasingly important projects and trusting him with client relationships that demanded both technical expertise and professional maturity.
Meridian itself was the kind of company that attracted ambitious professionals who wanted to work on meaningful projects without the bureaucratic constraints of larger corporations. Founded 15 years earlier by a group of software engineers who'd left major defense contractors to create a more agile and innovative organization, Meridian had built its reputation on delivering superior products while maintaining the kind of workplace culture that valued both professional excellence and
Life balance. The company's client base consisted primarily of military installations and government agencies that needed specialized software solutions for communication systems, data management platforms, and security protocols. These contracts were highly competitive and technically demanding, requiring teams that could collaborate effectively under pressure while maintaining the security clearances and compliance standards that government work demanded. David had found his niche in this environment, contributing to projects that genuinely served national security interests while building the kind of career that could support our family's long-term goals. Bob Harrison had joined Meridian about 3 years into David's tenure, arriving with impressive credentials and a track record of successful project management at larger defense contractors. His hiring had been seen as a coup for Meridian, bringing senior-level experience and established relationships with procurement officers who controlled major contract opportunities. Bob's resume showed progression through increasingly responsible positions at well-known firms, and his interview presentations had demonstrated both technical knowledge and leadership capabilities that impressed Meridian's executive team. Initially, Bob's arrival had seemed like a positive development for David's career prospects. As the new vice president of operations, Bob was responsible for overseeing project teams and client relationships, roles that required collaboration with senior analysts like David who understood both the technical requirements and the client expectations that drove successful contract performance. David had been optimistic about learning from Bob's experience and contributing to the expanded business opportunities his leadership might create. The working relationship between David and Bob had started professionally, with Bob acknowledging David's technical contributions and including him in strategic planning discussions that had previously been limited to more senior staff. Bob seemed to appreciate David's methodical approach to problem solving and his ability to communicate complex technical concepts to clients who needed to understand capabilities without getting lost in implementation details. For the first year of Bob's tenure, David felt that his career was advancing more rapidly than he'd expected. However, subtle changes in Bob's management style began emerging as he became more comfortable in his position and more confident about his authority within Meridian's hierarchy. The collaborative approach that had characterized his early months gave way to a more controlling and hierarchical management philosophy that emphasized his decision-making authority and the importance of following his directives without question. Bob began requiring more detailed reporting from his team members and involving himself in decisions that had previously been delegated to project leaders. David had mentioned some of these changes during our dinner conversations, describing them as typical growing pains that occurred when new executives established their leadership styles. He'd attributed Bob's increased oversight to the pressure of managing larger contracts and more complex client relationships, responsibilities that naturally required more centralized coordination and strategic planning. David's loyalty to Meridian and his respect for organizational hierarchy had prevented him from recognizing these changes as warning signs of more problematic leadership tendencies. The first indication that Bob's management approach might be problematic came during a client presentation that David had developed for a potential contract worth $8 million. David had spent weeks researching the client's requirements, developing technical specifications and creating presentation materials that demonstrated Meridian's capabilities while addressing the specific challenges the client needed to solve. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, with Bob planning to accompany David to provide senior-level representation and answer strategic questions about Meridian's long-term commitment to the project. On Monday evening, Bob had called David at home to discuss last-minute changes to the presentation strategy. During that conversation, Bob had made several comments about David's family situation that seemed inappropriate and irrelevant to the business discussion. He'd questioned whether David's family commitments might interfere with the travel requirements that a major contract would entail, suggesting that successful executives needed to prioritize business opportunities over domestic obligations. The comments had made David uncomfortable, but he'd assumed they reflected Bob's concern about project success rather than any judgment about our family's priorities. The client presentation itself had gone exceptionally well, with David's technical expertise and Bob's strategic overview combining to create a compelling case for Meridian's capabilities. The client had been impressed with both the technical solution and the professional presentation, expressing strong interest in moving forward with contract negotiations. David had felt proud of his contribution and optimistic about Meridian's prospects for winning what would be one of their largest contracts to date. However, Bob's behavior during the follow-up discussions had been troubling. He'd taken credit for elements of the presentation that David had developed, minimizing David's contributions while emphasizing his own strategic leadership. More concerning, Bob had made comments to the client about Meridian's deep bench of technical talent, implying that David was easily replaceable and that the client's relationship would be primarily with Bob rather than with the project team that would actually deliver the work. These incidents had created tension between David and Bob that affected their working relationship and David's confidence about his position within Meridian's hierarchy. Bob's management style had become increasingly unpredictable, alternating between public praise for David's work and private criticisms that seemed designed to undermine his confidence and establish Bob's dominance. David had begun to feel that his job security depended not on his technical performance or client relationships but on his ability to navigate Bob's moods and ego requirements. The situation had been further complicated by Bob's tendency to involve family considerations in professional discussions. He'd made several comments about the challenges of balancing career advancement with family responsibilities, often in contexts that suggested he viewed David's commitment to our family as a limitation on his professional potential. Bob seemed to believe that truly ambitious employees should be willing to sacrifice family time and personal relationships in service of their careers, an attitude that conflicted with both David's values and Meridian's stated commitment to work-life balance. Despite these growing concerns, David had remained committed to his work and optimistic about his long-term future at Meridian. He'd attributed Bob's behavior to the stress of managing increased responsibilities and the pressure of delivering results in a competitive industry. David's natural tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt, combined with his loyalty to Meridian and his appreciation for the opportunities the company had provided, had prevented him from recognizing the systematic nature of Bob's problematic behavior. As David's 10-year anniversary with Meridian approached, the company had decided to celebrate his milestone with a formal recognition dinner that would acknowledge his contributions and demonstrate Meridian's appreciation for employee loyalty. The anniversary celebration was Bob's idea, presented as an opportunity to showcase Meridian's commitment to recognizing dedicated employees, while also providing a networking opportunity for clients and senior staff. David had been genuinely touched by the gesture, interpreting it as evidence that his concerns about Bob's management style might have been overblown. The planning for the anniversary dinner had involved several meetings between David and Bob, during which Bob had emphasized the importance of presenting the right image to clients and senior executives who would be attending the event. Bob had offered suggestions about appropriate attire, conversation topics, and the kind of professional demeanor that would reflect well on both David and Meridian. These conversations had included several references to spouses and family members, with Bob expressing the importance of ensuring that family representatives would enhance rather than detract from the professional atmosphere of the celebration. At the time, David had interpreted Bob's comments as helpful guidance from a supervisor who wanted to ensure the event's success. Bob's emphasis on professional presentation and appropriate behavior had seemed like reasonable expectations for a formal corporate celebration. David had shared Bob's suggestions with me during our discussions about the upcoming dinner, and we'd both taken care to ensure that our preparation and appearance would meet the professional standards that the occasion required. What neither David nor I had understood was that Bob's comments about family representation and professional appropriateness were actually part of a pattern of judgment and evaluation that extended far beyond the anniversary dinner itself. Bob had been forming opinions about David's suitability for advancement based not just on his technical performance, but on his assessment of our family's alignment with what he considered appropriate corporate culture. The anniversary dinner wasn't just a celebration of David's achievements, it was an opportunity for Bob to evaluate whether David and his family met the social standards that Bob believed were necessary for continued advancement within Meridian's hierarchy. The evening of the anniversary dinner represented the culmination of months of growing tension between David's professional aspirations and Bob's increasingly problematic management approach. What was supposed to be a celebration of David's dedication and achievements had become a test of our family's worthiness to participate in Meridian's corporate culture. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately reveal the true nature of Bob's character and the extent to which his personal prejudices had infected his professional decision-making. As we prepared for that anniversary dinner, neither David nor I realized that we were walking into a situation that would fundamentally change our understanding of workplace dynamics, corporate culture, and the importance of standing up to discrimination regardless of the personal cost. The beautiful ballroom, elegant attire, and celebratory atmosphere would provide the backdrop for a moment of truth that would expose years of subtle discrimination and create an opportunity for justice that neither Bob Harrison nor Meridian's leadership could have anticipated. The first subtle warning sign that something wasn't quite right with Bob Harrison's leadership style emerged during a routine project review meeting in late spring. David had been leading a team developing a secure communication protocol for a military base in Nevada, a contract worth nearly $3 million that required intricate coordination between multiple departments. The project was proceeding ahead of schedule and under budget, with client feedback consistently praising both the technical innovation and the professional service Meridian was providing. During what should have been a celebratory progress meeting, Bob had made an unexpected comment that left David feeling unsettled. After reviewing the positive client feedback and project metrics, Bob had turned his attention to what he called sustainability factors that might affect the project's long-term success. He'd specifically questioned whether David's current work arrangement was optimal for managing such high-stakes client relationships, noting that successful project leadership often required total commitment that might be difficult to maintain with competing priorities at home. The comment had been delivered with Bob's characteristic smooth professionalism, couched in language that could be interpreted as constructive management feedback rather than personal criticism. But David had sensed an underlying message that his dedication to our family somehow compromised his professional effectiveness. When David had politely explained that his family commitments had never interfered with his work performance, Bob had simply nodded and moved on to other topics, leaving the impression that the conversation was far from over. That same week, David had noticed that Bob seemed to be paying unusual attention to the personal lives of his team members, asking detailed questions about family situations, weekend plans, and spouse employment that went well beyond normal workplace small talk. Bob had begun incorporating what he called work-life integration assessments into his management approach, claiming that understanding his employees' personal circumstances helped him make better decisions about project assignments and advancement opportunities. These assessments typically involved casual conversations that felt intrusive and inappropriate, with Bob probing into details about marital dynamics, child care arrangements, and financial pressures that seemed irrelevant to professional performance. Several of David's colleagues had mentioned feeling uncomfortable with Bob's questions, but none had felt confident enough to challenge a vice president who controlled their career prospects. The consensus among the team was that Bob's management style was evolving in ways that felt increasingly personal and judgmental. David had initially tried to give Bob the benefit of the doubt, reasoning that a new executive might need time to develop appropriate boundaries between professional oversight and personal inquiry. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Bob's interest in his employees' personal lives wasn't driven by genuine concern for their well-being, but rather by a desire to evaluate their commitment to what he considered proper corporate priorities. Bob seemed to believe that successful employees should organize their entire lives around work requirements, with family considerations taking a distant second place to professional obligations. The pattern became more obvious during a team dinner that Bob had organized to celebrate the successful completion of a challenging project phase. What was supposed to be a relaxed celebration had turned into an uncomfortable interrogation session, as Bob systematically questioned each team member about their spouse's career, their children's activities, and their personal financial goals. He'd made pointed comments about the importance of having a supportive family structure that understood the demands of high-level professional success. When the conversation had turned to David, Bob had expressed particular interest in my decision to step away from defense contracting to focus on raising our children. He'd asked several questions about whether I missed the excitement of corporate life and whether I found suburban domesticity fulfilling after the challenges of government contracting work. The questions had been phrased as friendly curiosity, but David had detected an underlying judgment about the choices our family had made and the priorities we'd established. Bob's interest in my professional background had initially seemed positive, with him acknowledging my experience in defense marketing and commenting on the value of having industry knowledge within the team's extended network. But as the conversation continued, his tone had shifted toward what felt like criticism of my current role as a stay-at-home mother.
He'd made several comments about the waste of talent that occurred when accomplished women stepped away from their careers, suggesting that such decisions reflected a lack of ambition that might be contagious within a professional environment. The dinner conversation had concluded with Bob expressing hope that David's family situation would continue to evolve in ways that supported his professional growth. He'd specifically mentioned that advancement to senior management positions often required sacrifices and lifestyle adjustments that not all families were prepared to make. The implication was clear: Bob viewed our current family arrangement as a potential obstacle to David's career advancement, and he expected changes that would demonstrate David's commitment to putting work ahead of personal considerations. These incidents had created a climate of anxiety and uncertainty that affected not just David's relationship with Bob, but the entire team's morale and productivity. Bob's management approach had transformed what had been a collaborative and supportive work environment into something that felt more like a constant evaluation, with personal choices and family circumstances becoming factors in professional assessment. Team members had begun to feel that their job security depended not just on their technical performance, but on their ability to present the kind of personal life that Bob considered appropriate for corporate advancement. The situation had escalated further when Bob had begun making unscheduled visits to David's cubicle, ostensibly to discuss project details, but actually to engage in what felt like surveillance of David's work habits and personal communications. Bob would arrive without warning, position himself where he could observe David's computer screen and phone conversations, and ask detailed questions about how David was spending his time and managing his responsibilities. These visits always included casual inquiries about family activities, weekend plans, and evening commitments that seemed designed to assess whether David was dedicating sufficient time and energy to work-related concerns. During one particularly uncomfortable encounter, Bob had noticed a family photo on David's desk that showed Emma and Jake at a school carnival. Bob had picked up the photo and made several comments about the importance of children understanding that their father's professional success required certain sacrifices and compromises from the entire family. He'd specifically mentioned that successful executives' children learned early to be proud of their father's dedication to work, even when that dedication meant missing some family activities and social events. The conversation had taken an even more disturbing turn when Bob had begun discussing his own family philosophy, describing how he'd structured his household to support his professional ambitions without the distractions that could undermine career focus. He'd spoken approvingly of his wife's role as a corporate asset, who understood that her primary responsibility was to enhance his professional image and facilitate his business relationships. Bob had made it clear that he viewed spouses as extensions of their husbands' careers, with their value measured by their ability to contribute to professional success rather than by their individual accomplishments or personal fulfillment. These revelations about Bob's attitudes toward family and marriage had helped David understand the source of the growing tension in their working relationship. Bob wasn't just evaluating David's technical performance or leadership potential, he was assessing whether our family structure and personal priorities aligned with his vision of what a successful executive's life should look like. Bob's increasing criticism and oversight weren't responses to any decline in David's work quality, but rather expressions of his disapproval of choices our family had made about work-life balance and personal priorities. The pattern of inappropriate personal scrutiny had reached a breaking point during a client meeting that Bob had insisted on attending despite having no direct involvement in the project. The meeting was with representatives from an Air Force base in Colorado, long-term clients who had specifically requested David's continued involvement in their software development projects. David had been looking forward to the meeting as an opportunity to strengthen existing relationships and potentially expand Meridian's work with this important client. Bob's behavior during the client meeting had been professionally embarrassing and personally insulting. He'd repeatedly interrupted David's technical presentations to offer his own commentary, often contradicting information that David knew to be accurate based on his years of experience with this particular client. More troubling, Bob had made several references to David's evolving role within Meridian's hierarchy, suggesting to the client that David might not be available for future projects due to personal commitments that were affecting his professional availability. The client representatives had been visibly confused by Bob's comments, since their experience with David had been consistently positive, and they had no reason to believe his availability or commitment had changed. When they directly asked David about his continued involvement in their projects, Bob had interjected to explain that Meridian was restructuring its approach to client relationships to ensure that personal factors didn't interfere with professional service delivery. The implication was clear: Bob was using the client meeting as a platform to undermine David's professional relationships while positioning himself as a more reliable alternative. After the client meeting, David had requested a private conversation with Bob to address what had happened and clarify his role in future client interactions. The conversation had revealed the full extent of Bob's problematic attitudes and confirmed David's growing suspicion that his job security was being threatened by factors that had nothing to do with his professional performance. Bob had been surprisingly direct about his concerns, making it clear that he viewed David's family commitments as incompatible with the level of dedication required for continued advancement within Meridian's hierarchy. Bob had specifically criticized our decision to have me focus on raising our children rather than pursuing my own career, suggesting that this arrangement demonstrated a lack of ambition that could be detrimental to Meridian's corporate culture. He'd argued that successful companies needed employees whose entire families were aligned with professional goals, with spouses who could serve as business assets rather than domestic distractions. Bob had made it clear that he viewed my role as a stay-at-home mother as evidence that David wasn't sufficiently committed to maximizing his professional potential. The conversation had concluded with Bob delivering what amounted to an ultimatum about David's future with Meridian. He'd suggested that David needed to make some lifestyle adjustments that would demonstrate his commitment to putting professional advancement ahead of personal convenience. These adjustments would include increased travel requirements, weekend work commitments, and participation in social events that would require my presence as David's spouse. Bob had emphasized that advancement opportunities would be limited for employees whose family situations didn't support the kind of total professional engagement that senior positions required. Most disturbing had been Bob's specific comments about the upcoming anniversary dinner, which he'd positioned not as a celebration of David's achievements, but as an evaluation opportunity that would help determine David's suitability for future advancement. Bob had made it clear that my behavior and presentation at the anniversary dinner would be considered a reflection of David's professional judgment and his family's alignment with Meridian's corporate values. The anniversary celebration that David had been looking forward to as recognition of his decade of dedicated service had been transformed into a test that could determine his entire future with the company. These revelations had left David feeling trapped between his loyalty to Meridian and his commitment to our family's values and priorities. Bob's ultimatum had created an impossible situation where David's professional security depended on compromising the principles and relationships that were most important to him. The stress of this conflict had begun affecting David's health and happiness, with him losing sleep and struggling to concentrate on work while worrying about how to navigate Bob's increasingly unreasonable demands. David had considered discussing the situation with Meridian's Human Resources Department, but Bob's position as Vice President of Operations made such a complaint risky and potentially futile. Bob's seniority within the company hierarchy, combined with his track record of successful project management and client relationship development, gave him credibility and influence that could easily overwhelm David's concerns about inappropriate personal scrutiny. Additionally, Bob had been careful to frame his comments as legitimate business concerns rather than personal discrimination, making it difficult to document specific violations of company policy. The anniversary dinner had taken on enormous significance as the culmination of months of growing tension and the final test of our family's ability to meet Bob's expectations for appropriate corporate behavior. David had spent weeks preparing for the event, agonizing over every detail of our presentation and behavior to ensure that nothing could be criticized or used as justification for negative consequences to his career. The celebration that should have been a joyful recognition of David's achievements had become a source of anxiety and stress that affected our entire family's well-being. As the date of the anniversary dinner approached, David had become increasingly nervous about potential complications or problems that could provide Bob with ammunition for future criticism. He'd rehearsed conversations we might have with colleagues and clients, suggested topics that would be safe to discuss, and even recommended specific responses to questions that might arise during the evening. David's anxiety about the event had transformed what should have been a proud moment into something that felt more like a performance review with our family's future hanging in the balance. The week before the anniversary dinner, Bob had made several additional comments that increased the pressure and made it clear that he would be evaluating every aspect of our behavior and presentation. He'd mentioned the importance of spouses who could hold their own in professional conversations, suggesting that corporate events were opportunities for families to demonstrate their understanding of business culture and their ability to represent their spouse's professional interests effectively. Bob had specifically emphasized that the anniversary dinner would include several important clients and senior executives whose opinions could significantly impact David's future opportunities within Meridian. These final warnings had made it clear that Bob viewed the anniversary dinner not as a celebration, but as a crucial test of our family's suitability for continued inclusion in Meridian's corporate community. The evening would provide him with an opportunity to evaluate my behavior, appearance, and
conversation skills against his personal standards for what constituted appropriate corporate spouse behavior. More ominously, Bob had positioned the event as a chance for him to demonstrate his authority over David's career by publicly passing judgment on our family's worthiness to participate in Meridian's professional culture. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would reveal the true extent of Bob's discriminatory attitudes and provide an opportunity for justice that none of us could have anticipated. The anniversary dinner that Bob had conceived as a platform for asserting his control over David's career would instead become the moment when his own professional judgment and character would be exposed and evaluated by forces far more powerful than his position within Meridian's hierarchy. The evening that was supposed to celebrate David's decade of dedication to Meridian would ultimately become the catalyst for Bob's own professional destruction and the beginning of a new chapter in our family's relationship with workplace discrimination and corporate accountability. The morning after the anniversary dinner disaster, I woke up with a clarity of purpose that surprised me with its intensity. While David sat at our kitchen table, still processing the humiliation and wondering how to salvage his career from Bob Harrison's public dismissal of his wife, I was already formulating a strategic response that would turn Bob's moment of triumph into the beginning of his professional downfall. The rage I felt wasn't the hot, impulsive anger that leads to rash decisions, but the cold, calculating fury that had once made me effective in high-stakes defense contracting negotiations. My first step was to document everything I could remember from the previous evening, not just Bob's final insulting comment, but every interaction, every subtle put-down, every inappropriate remark I'd witnessed throughout the dinner. I opened my laptop and began creating a detailed timeline of events, recording specific quotes, noting witnesses who had been present during various conversations, and establishing a comprehensive record of Bob's behavior that could support a formal complaint or investigation. The documentation process revealed patterns I hadn't fully recognized during the evening itself. Bob's treatment of me hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment fueled by alcohol and arrogance. Instead, it had been the culmination of a systematic evaluation process where he'd assessed not just my appearance and behavior, but my suitability as a corporate spouse according to his personal prejudices about gender roles, professional hierarchies, and family structures. His final public humiliation had been delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his position of authority made him immune to consequences. As I worked through my recollections of the evening, I realized that Bob's behavior toward other employees' spouses had followed similar patterns of judgment and dismissal. I'd witnessed him making subtle but cutting comments to several women, questioning their career choices, criticizing their understanding of business culture, and generally treating them as extensions of their husbands rather than as individuals deserving of basic respect and courtesy. The anniversary dinner hadn't been just about David's recognition, it had been Bob's opportunity to assert his authority over the personal lives and family relationships of his subordinates. The more I analyzed Bob's behavior, the more convinced I became that his actions constituted a clear pattern of workplace discrimination that violated both Meridian's stated policies and the federal compliance requirements that govern companies holding government contracts. Bob hadn't just insulted me personally, he'd created a hostile work environment that affected David's career prospects based on discriminatory judgments about our family structure and personal choices. This wasn't about hurt feelings or wounded pride, it was about systematic workplace abuse that needed to be addressed through appropriate channels. My strategic planning was interrupted by a phone call from Maria Santos, whose husband Tom had witnessed the entire anniversary dinner confrontation. Maria was calling to check on my well-being and express her outrage about Bob's behavior, but her call provided me with something even more valuable: confirmation that other employees and their families had been subjected to similar treatment over the years. Maria had been documenting her own concerns about Bob's management style and its impact on Tom's work environment, creating a record of incidents that corroborated my own observations. Maria's information revealed that Bob's discriminatory behavior extended far beyond his treatment of spouses at corporate events. Tom had shared stories about Bob's inappropriate comments regarding female employees, his dismissive attitude toward workers who prioritized family commitments over unlimited work availability, and his general pattern of using personal information as leverage in professional relationships. Several employees had considered filing complaints about Bob's management approach but had been discouraged by his senior position and the potential career consequences of challenging a vice president. The conversation with Maria helped me understand that Bob's treatment of me at the anniversary dinner hadn't been an aberration but rather a public display of attitudes and behaviors that had been affecting Meridian's workplace culture for years. Bob had felt comfortable publicly humiliating David's wife because he'd been engaging in similar behavior privately without facing any meaningful consequences. The anniversary dinner had simply provided him with a larger audience for demonstrating the power he wielded over his subordinates' professional and personal lives. Armed with this broader context about Bob's pattern of discriminatory behavior, I felt confident that my complaint would be taken seriously by the appropriate authorities. This wasn't about a single incident of poor judgment that could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or personality conflict. Instead, it represented systematic workplace discrimination that created hostile conditions for employees and violated the professional standards required of companies holding federal contracts. Bob's behavior constituted exactly the kind of compliance violation that could result in contract suspension and serious legal consequences for Meridian. The decision to contact Jennifer Walsh hadn't been made lightly, but my conversation with Maria had convinced me that formal intervention was necessary to address problems that extended far beyond my personal experience. Bob's discriminatory behavior was affecting multiple employees and their families, creating a toxic work environment that contradicted Meridian's stated commitment to professionalism and respect. As Deputy Director of Federal Acquisition Programs, Jennifer had both the authority and the responsibility to investigate compliance violations at companies holding government contracts. When I called Jennifer that Tuesday morning, her immediate concern and professional attention confirmed that I'd made the right decision. Jennifer understood the serious implications of discriminatory behavior by executives at federal contractors, recognizing that such conduct violated multiple regulatory requirements and could jeopardize Meridian's ability to maintain their government business. Her questions were thorough and focused, designed to establish the scope of the problem and determine the appropriate level of response from federal oversight authorities. Jennifer's investigation began within hours of our conversation, with compliance officers arriving at Meridian's offices that same afternoon to begin reviewing personnel records, interviewing employees, and examining the company's policies and procedures for addressing workplace discrimination. The investigation team had broad authority to access internal communications, review complaint procedures, and interview current and former employees about their experiences with discriminatory behavior or hostile work environment conditions. David called me from work that afternoon, his voice filled with amazement and a growing sense of vindication as he described the scene unfolding at Meridian. Federal investigators had arrived without warning, presenting credentials and documentation that required immediate cooperation from company leadership. Bob Harrison had been summoned to an emergency meeting with investigators, emerging pale and shaken after what David described as an intensive interview session that lasted nearly 3 hours. The investigation had created an atmosphere of nervous anticipation throughout Meridian's offices, with employees speculating about the reasons for federal scrutiny and wondering whether their own experiences with workplace discrimination might be relevant to the inquiry. Several employees had been contacted for interviews, and word was spreading quickly that the investigation focused on discriminatory behavior and compliance violations that could affect Meridian's government contracts. Bob's confident demeanor from the anniversary dinner had been replaced by obvious anxiety and uncertainty about his professional future. The investigation's scope expanded as federal compliance officers uncovered additional evidence of discriminatory practices and policy violations that extended beyond Bob's individual behavior. Meridian's Human Resources Department had failed to maintain adequate procedures for addressing discrimination complaints, and several formal grievances against Bob had been buried or dismissed without proper investigation. The company's training programs were inadequate, its reporting procedures were ineffective, and its leadership had failed to address obvious problems with workplace culture and management accountability. Jennifer called me that evening to provide an update on the investigation's initial findings and to prepare me for potential next steps in the process. The compliance review had already uncovered substantial evidence of discriminatory behavior and policy violations that could result in serious consequences for both Bob Harrison personally and Meridian Tech Solutions as a government contractor. Federal investigators had documented a pattern of discriminatory conduct that violated civil rights laws, workplace harassment regulations, and the professional standards required of companies holding federal contracts. The most damaging evidence had come from Meridian's own internal communications and personnel records, which revealed that Bob's discriminatory behavior had been ongoing for years and had been reported through proper channels without appropriate response from company leadership. Email communications showed Bob making inappropriate comments about employees' family situations, questioning women's commitment to their careers, and using personal information to make decisions about assignments and advancement opportunities. The paper trail demonstrated systematic discrimination that created a hostile work environment for multiple employees. Additional interviews with current and former employees had revealed the full extent of Bob's inappropriate behavior and its impact on workplace morale and productivity. Several women employees had experienced direct discrimination from Bob, including inappropriate questions about family planning, criticism of work-life balance choices, and exclusion from advancement opportunities based on assumptions about their personal priorities. Male employees had also been affected by Bob's discriminatory attitudes, particularly those who prioritized family commitments or whose spouses didn't meet Bob's standards for appropriate corporate behavior. The investigation had also uncovered financial irregularities in Bob's management of departmental budgets and project resources, with evidence suggesting that he'd used his position to provide preferential treatment to employees who met his personal approval while limiting opportunities for those he viewed as insufficiently committed to corporate priorities. These findings expanded the scope of potential violations beyond workplace discrimination to include misuse of company resources and breach of fiduciary responsibility that could result in additional legal consequences. Jennifer explained that the investigation's findings would likely result in immediate corrective action by Meridian's leadership, including Bob's termination and implementation of comprehensive policy changes designed to prevent future discrimination and ensure compliance with federal requirements. The company faced potential suspension of government contracts, financial penalties, and ongoing federal oversight until they could demonstrate sustained improvement in workplace culture and management practices. Bob personally faced potential civil rights violations that could result in legal liability and permanent damage to his professional reputation. The speed and thoroughness of the federal response had exceeded my expectations, but Jennifer explained that discriminatory behavior by executives at government contractors was treated as a serious compliance violation that required immediate and comprehensive intervention. Companies holding federal contracts were required to maintain discrimination-free workplaces and ensure that their leadership met the professional standards expected of businesses serving government clients. Bob's behavior had violated multiple regulatory requirements and created liability for Meridian that could affect their ability to maintain their government business relationships. By Thursday morning, Meridian's CEO Michael Thompson had scheduled an emergency all-hands meeting to address what he described as serious compliance issues that require immediate corrective action. David arrived at work to find Bob's office empty and his nameplate removed, with security guards stationed nearby to ensure that he couldn't access company property or communications systems. The message was clear: Bob Harrison's tenure at Meridian Tech Solutions had ended abruptly and permanently. The all-hands meeting had been somber and direct, with Thompson acknowledging that federal investigators had uncovered evidence of discriminatory behavior and policy violations that contradicted Meridian's stated values and threatened the company's government contracts. He announced Bob's immediate termination for cause, apologized to employees who had been affected by discriminatory treatment, and outlined comprehensive changes to company policies and procedures designed to prevent future incidents and ensure compliance with federal requirements. Thompson had also announced my role in bringing the discrimination issues to federal attention, expressing gratitude for my courage in reporting violations and emphasizing that employee protection from retaliation was a top priority for company leadership. The announcement had generated supportive responses from employees who had experienced similar treatment from Bob, with several approaching David to share their own stories and express appreciation for the action that had finally addressed long-standing problems with workplace culture and management accountability. The most satisfying moment had come when Thompson announced David's promotion to Senior Project Manager, a position that recognized his technical expertise and professional integrity while providing him with increased authority and responsibility for client relationships.
The promotion included a significant salary increase, expanded benefits, and leadership responsibilities that would allow David to contribute to Meridian's efforts to rebuild its workplace culture and restore its reputation with federal clients. Bob's professional downfall had been swift and comprehensive, with news of his termination spreading quickly through Phoenix's defense contracting community. His reputation for discriminatory behavior and compliance violations made him essentially unemployable at companies holding government contracts, effectively ending his career in the industry where he'd spent decades building his professional identity. The federal investigation had created a permanent record of his discriminatory conduct that would follow him to any future employment opportunities. The impact of Bob's termination extended beyond his individual consequences to create positive changes throughout Meridian's organizational culture. Thompson had appointed a new vice president of operations who prioritized inclusive management practices and professional development opportunities for all employees regardless of their personal circumstances. The company had implemented mandatory sensitivity training, established clear procedures for reporting discriminatory behavior, and created accountability measures that would prevent future violations of workplace standards. 6 months after the anniversary dinner confrontation, David and I attended Meridian's annual holiday party as proud representatives of a company that had transformed its culture and renewed its commitment to treating all employees and their families with dignity and respect. The contrast with the previous year's anniversary dinner was striking, with company leadership demonstrating genuine appreciation for employee contributions while creating an atmosphere of inclusion and celebration that welcomed families rather than judging them according to arbitrary social standards. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of standing up to discrimination regardless of the personal cost or professional risk involved. Bob Harrison's assumption that I would silently absorb his humiliation because of my current role as a stay-at-home mother had proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation that ultimately destroyed his career and created positive change for countless other employees and families. My willingness to use my professional network and expertise to address workplace discrimination had demonstrated that power comes not from titles or positions but from knowledge, relationships, and the courage to act when action is required. The transformation of my own identity through this experience had been as significant as the changes at Meridian Tech Solutions. The woman who had absorbed Bob's insults at the anniversary dinner had discovered reserves of strength and determination that I hadn't recognized in myself for years. My decision to fight back against discrimination had reconnected me with the professional competence and strategic thinking that had made me successful in defense contracting, reminding me that stepping away from corporate life to focus on family didn't mean abandoning the skills and relationships that continued to define my capabilities. Today, when I think about that anniversary dinner and Bob Harrison's sneering comment about my failure to fit in with Meridian's corporate culture, I feel gratitude rather than anger. His discriminatory behavior had provided me with an opportunity to demonstrate that true power comes from integrity, preparation, and the willingness to fight for what's right regardless of the personal cost. The phone call that destroyed his career and transformed David's workplace had proven that underestimating people based on superficial judgments isn't just morally wrong, it's strategically foolish and potentially catastrophic for those who practice discrimination. The anniversary dinner that was supposed to celebrate David's decade of service to Meridian had instead become the catalyst for positive change that improved working conditions for hundreds of employees and their families. Bob's moment of triumph had been transformed into a lesson about accountability, justice, and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect regardless of their personal circumstances or family choices. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination comes not from the person being targeted but from someone who understands how to leverage existing systems and relationships to create meaningful change that extends far beyond individual grievances. The months following Bob Harrison's termination brought changes to our family that extended far beyond David's professional vindication and career advancement. The experience of confronting workplace discrimination and witnessing the swift consequences of federal intervention had awakened something in me that had been dormant since I'd stepped away from my corporate career. The woman who had made that strategic phone call to Jennifer Walsh was someone I was rediscovering, confident, decisive, and unafraid to use her skills and connections to create positive change in the world. My newfound sense of empowerment began manifesting in unexpected ways throughout our daily lives. Where I had previously approached family decisions with careful deference to David's career priorities, I now found myself contributing strategic thinking and professional insights that enhanced our decision-making as a team. The experience of successfully challenging Bob's discriminatory behavior had reminded me that my years in defense contracting had equipped me with valuable skills that remained relevant and powerful even after stepping away from full-time professional work. The transformation was perhaps most evident in my interactions with other parents and community members who were facing their own challenges with workplace discrimination, educational inequities, and institutional barriers that seemed insurmountable to individuals acting alone. Word of my successful challenge to Bob Harrison had spread through our social and professional networks, leading to conversations with women who were experiencing similar problems but felt powerless to address them effectively. These conversations revealed a consistent pattern of intelligent, capable people who had accepted unfair treatment because they believed their individual voices couldn't create meaningful change. Maria Santos had been the first to approach me about leveraging my experience to help other families navigate workplace discrimination challenges. Her husband Tom's colleague at a different defense contractor was experiencing retaliation for requesting family leave to care for his elderly mother, with his supervisor making pointed comments about dedication and reliability that clearly violated federal employment protections. The colleague felt trapped between his family responsibilities and his professional security, unsure how to address the situation without jeopardizing his career and his family's financial stability. The case presented an opportunity to apply the lessons I'd learned from challenging Bob Harrison's behavior while expanding my understanding of how discrimination manifests in different workplace contexts. Unlike my situation where Bob's discriminatory attitudes had been obvious and well documented, this case involved more subtle forms of retaliation that required careful investigation and strategic documentation to establish a clear pattern of violations. The challenge appealed to my analytical nature and my growing desire to use my professional skills in service of positive social change. Working with Tom's colleague, I helped develop a comprehensive documentation strategy that captured not just the obvious incidents of retaliation but the broader context of discriminatory attitudes and practices that created a hostile environment for employees with family caregiving responsibilities. The process required interviewing coworkers, reviewing company policies, and identifying the specific federal regulations that protected employees from retaliation for exercising their legitimate rights to family leave and workplace accommodations. The investigation revealed systemic problems with the company's approach to family leave and employee rights that extended far beyond Tom's colleague's individual situation. Management had been routinely discouraging employees from taking legally protected leave, creating informal penalties for workers who prioritized family responsibilities, and maintaining a culture that valued unlimited availability over professional competence and legal compliance. The pattern of violations provided a strong foundation for federal intervention that could benefit multiple employees while establishing clear expectations for future management behavior. My involvement in this second discrimination case had confirmed my suspicion that workplace violations were often systemic rather than isolated incidents requiring comprehensive responses that addressed organizational culture rather than just individual misconduct. The experience also demonstrated that my skills in strategic analysis, relationship building, and regulatory compliance remained sharp and valuable despite my years away from full-time professional work. The successful resolution of both cases had established my reputation as someone who could effectively challenge institutional discrimination while protecting the individuals who brought violations to light. These early successes in addressing workplace discrimination led to a steady stream of requests for assistance from individuals and families throughout the Phoenix area who were facing similar challenges. The cases varied widely in their specific circumstances and legal implications, but they shared common themes of power imbalances, institutional indifference, and individual isolation that made effective response difficult for people acting alone. My role evolved into something between consultant and advocate, helping people understand their rights, document violations, and access appropriate resources for addressing their specific situations. The diversity of cases that came to my attention revealed the breadth and complexity of discrimination issues affecting working families throughout the defense contracting industry and beyond. Women were facing pregnancy discrimination, veterans were experiencing retaliation for seeking disability accommodations, and minority employees were being excluded from advancement opportunities through subtle but systematic bias in assignment and evaluation processes. Each case presented unique challenges and learning opportunities that expanded my understanding of how discrimination operates in different contexts and how effective responses must be tailored to specific circumstances and legal frameworks. One particularly complex case involved a female engineer at a major aerospace contractor who was being systematically excluded from high-profile projects after returning from maternity leave. Her supervisor had made several comments about her divided loyalties and questioned her commitment to demanding projects that required extensive travel and overtime work. The discrimination was subtle but pervasive, affecting her professional development opportunities and long-term career prospects in ways that would be difficult to prove through traditional complaint processes. The aerospace case required developing new approaches to documentation and evidence gathering that could capture patterns of exclusion and bias that might not be obvious in individual incidents. Working with the engineer, I helped establish a comprehensive record of project assignments, meeting invitations, and professional
development opportunities that revealed clear disparities in treatment before and after her maternity leave. The documentation process also uncovered similar patterns affecting other women employees, establishing a broader context of discriminatory practices that strengthened the case for systematic intervention. The investigation's findings had attracted attention from federal compliance officers who were responsible for ensuring that aerospace contractors maintained equal employment opportunities as required by their government contracts. The company's discriminatory practices violated multiple federal regulations and could result in contract suspension or cancellation that would affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in revenue. The stakes were high enough to motivate immediate corrective action by company leadership, including policy changes, training programs, and accountability measures designed to prevent future discrimination. As my involvement in discrimination cases became more extensive and sophisticated, I began to recognize the need for more formal structure and resources to support the growing demand for assistance. Individual casework was valuable and necessary, but the scope of discrimination problems affecting working families required systematic approaches that could address root causes rather than just individual symptoms. The pattern of violations I was documenting suggested that many employers were either unaware of their legal obligations or confident that violations would go unchallenged due to employees' fear of retaliation and lack of resources for effective response. The decision to establish a formal consulting practice focused on workplace discrimination and compliance issues had evolved naturally from the success of my individual casework and the growing recognition that my skills and experience were uniquely valuable in this field. My background in defense contracting provided credibility with both employers and regulatory agencies, while my personal experience with discrimination gave me insight into the emotional and professional challenges faced by employees who were considering challenging unfair treatment. Desert Advocacy Solutions, the consulting firm I established in a small office near our home, specialized in helping individuals and families navigate workplace discrimination while also providing compliance consulting services to employers who wanted to prevent violations and maintain positive workplace cultures. The dual approach allowed me to address discrimination issues from multiple perspectives while building sustainable revenue streams that could support expanded services and community outreach programs. The business model proved successful beyond my initial expectations, with demand for services growing rapidly as word spread through professional networks and community organizations. Employees appreciated having access to expert guidance and strategic support that could level the playing field when challenging institutional discrimination, while employers valued compliance consulting that could prevent costly violations and protect their government contracts. The combination of advocacy and prevention services created a comprehensive approach to workplace discrimination that addressed both immediate problems and long-term cultural change. David's own career continued to flourish in the positive environment that had emerged at Meridian Tech Solutions following Bob Harrison's termination and the company's comprehensive policy reforms. His promotion to senior project manager had provided opportunities to demonstrate leadership skills and technical expertise that had been underutilized under Bob's discriminatory management approach. The new vice president of operations had recognized David's potential and provided mentorship and advancement opportunities that reflected his actual performance rather than arbitrary judgments about his family situation. The contrast between David's experience under Bob's management and his current professional satisfaction had reinforced our understanding of how discrimination can limit not just individual careers but organizational effectiveness and innovation. Bob's discriminatory attitudes had created an environment where talented employees were undervalued and underutilized based on irrelevant personal factors rather than professional competence. The culture change at Meridian had unleashed creativity and productivity that had been suppressed by Bob's toxic leadership style, demonstrating the business case for inclusive management practices. Our children Emma and Jake had also benefited from the positive changes in our family's dynamics and David's increased job satisfaction. The stress and anxiety that had characterized David's final months under Bob's supervision had been replaced by enthusiasm and confidence that made him more present and engaged as a father. Emma had noticed the difference immediately, commenting that Daddy seemed happier at work and more fun during family activities. Jake had responded to the improved family atmosphere by becoming more open about his own school experiences and more confident in pursuing challenging academic and social opportunities. The experience of successfully challenging discrimination had also influenced how David and I approached parenting decisions and conversations about fairness, justice, and standing up for what's right. Emma and Jake had witnessed their parents confronting unfair treatment and achieving positive outcomes through strategic action and principled persistence. The lessons they absorbed from our experience would serve them well as they encountered their own challenges with institutional unfairness and social injustice throughout their lives. My consulting practice continued to expand as more individuals and organizations sought assistance with discrimination issues and compliance challenges. The cases became increasingly complex and high-profile, involving major corporations, government agencies, and industry-wide practices that affected thousands of employees. My reputation for effective advocacy and strategic thinking had attracted attention from civil rights organizations, legal advocacy groups, and federal agencies that were seeking expert consultation on discrimination prevention and response strategies. One particularly significant case involved a class action discrimination lawsuit against a major defense contractor that had been systematically excluding women from leadership positions through biased promotion processes and hostile workplace cultures. My role as an expert consultant required analyzing company policies, reviewing statistical data on employment patterns, and providing strategic guidance on legal approaches that could achieve meaningful reform rather than just financial settlements. The case presented opportunities to influence industry-wide practices while demonstrating the economic and social costs of discriminatory employment practices. The class action case had also provided a platform for public speaking and media interviews that expanded awareness of workplace discrimination issues while establishing my credibility as a thought leader in this field. The interviews had generated additional case referrals and consulting opportunities while contributing to broader conversations about gender equality, workplace culture, and the importance of holding employers accountable for discriminatory practices. The public visibility had transformed my consulting practice from a local service provider into a regional resource for discrimination advocacy and compliance consulting. As Desert Advocacy Solutions approached its second anniversary, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had led from Bob Harrison's insulting comment at David's anniversary dinner to the establishment of a thriving consulting practice focused on workplace justice and equality. The woman who had absorbed Bob's humiliation in stunned silence had evolved into someone who could effectively challenge institutional discrimination while building sustainable systems for preventing future violations. The transformation had been both personal and professional, reconnecting me with skills and passions that had been dormant while revealing new capabilities and interests that continued to drive my work. The success of my consulting practice had also created opportunities to give back to the community through pro bono services for individuals who couldn't afford professional advocacy assistance. Working with domestic violence survivors who were facing workplace retaliation, immigrants who were experiencing ethnic discrimination, and veterans who were being denied reasonable accommodations had expanded my understanding of how discrimination intersects with other forms of social injustice and economic inequality. These cases were often the most challenging and rewarding, requiring creative approaches and collaborative partnerships with other advocacy organizations. The pro bono work had led to speaking engagements at community colleges, professional associations, and women's organizations throughout Arizona and neighboring states. The presentations provided opportunities to educate audiences about workplace rights, discrimination prevention, and effective advocacy strategies while inspiring others to become involved in social justice efforts within their own communities. The speaking engagements also generated media coverage and networking opportunities that continued to expand the reach and impact of my advocacy work. Looking back on the anniversary dinner that had catalyzed so many positive changes in our lives, I felt grateful for Bob Harrison's discriminatory behavior and the opportunity it had provided to rediscover my own power and purpose. His assumption that I would silently accept humiliation because of my role as a stay-at-home mother had proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation that ultimately destroyed his career while launching mine in an entirely new direction. The phone call that had ended his professional life had become the foundation for work that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I had accomplished during my years in corporate defense contracting. The experience had taught me that true power comes not from titles or positions but from knowledge, relationships, and the courage to act when action is required. Bob's discriminatory attitudes had reflected outdated assumptions about gender roles and family priorities that had no place in modern workplaces. But his downfall had demonstrated that such attitudes carry serious consequences when challenged by people who understand how to leverage legal protections and institutional accountability mechanisms effectively. David's continued success at Meridian Tech Solutions, my thriving consulting practice, and our family's strengthened bonds had all emerged from our decision to confront discrimination rather than accept it as an unfortunate but unchangeable aspect of workplace culture. The anniversary dinner that was supposed to celebrate David's past achievements had instead become the launching pad for future accomplishments that exceeded anything we had previously imagined possible. Sometimes the most devastating attacks on our dignity and self-worth can become catalysts for transformation and growth that ultimately make us stronger and more effective than we ever believed we could be. 5 years after that fateful anniversary dinner, I stood before a packed auditorium at Arizona State University's College of Business, delivering the keynote address at their annual Women in Leadership Conference. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman Bob Harrison had dismissed as someone who didn't fit in with corporate culture was now being invited to speak about workplace transformation and advocacy strategies to the next generation of business leaders. The audience included students, professionals, and executives who were eager to learn from my journey and apply those lessons to their own challenges with discrimination and institutional change. The speech I delivered that day had evolved through hundreds of presentations to diverse audiences across the Southwest, but the core message remained consistent. It's strategically foolish and economically costly for organizations that want to compete effectively in modern markets. The research I'd conducted for Desert Advocacy Solutions had documented the measurable impact of inclusive workplace cultures on productivity, innovation, and employee retention, providing business leaders with compelling evidence that diversity and equality weren't just social justice issues but competitive advantages in increasingly complex global markets. The statistical evidence I presented to the ASU audience was striking and undeniable. Companies with inclusive leadership teams consistently outperformed their competitors in revenue growth, customer satisfaction, and market share expansion. Organizations that eliminated discriminatory practices experienced reduced turnover, lower legal costs, and improved reputation metrics that translated directly into bottom-line financial benefits. The data made it clear that Bob Harrison's discriminatory management style hadn't just been personally offensive and legally problematic, it had been a fundamental business mistake that limited Meridian's potential for growth and success. The question and answer session following my keynote address revealed the continuing prevalence of workplace discrimination and the hunger among young professionals for practical strategies to address unfair treatment without jeopardizing their career prospects. Students shared stories about internship experiences where they'd witnessed discriminatory behavior but felt powerless to respond effectively. Young professionals described workplace situations where they were struggling to balance their desire for advancement with their commitment to family responsibilities and personal values. One particularly poignant question came from a recent graduate who was considering whether to accept a position at a company where she'd observed concerning attitudes toward work-life balance during her interview process. Her question reflected the difficult choices facing many young women who understood that certain workplace cultures could limit their long-term career prospects but felt pressure to accept available opportunities in competitive job markets. Her situation reminded me of my own early career decisions and the importance of having mentors and advocates who could provide guidance during critical transition moments. My response to her question drew on lessons learned not just from my own experience with Bob Harrison but from the hundreds of discrimination cases I'd handled through Desert Advocacy Solutions. I emphasized the importance of conducting thorough research on potential employers, asking pointed questions about advancement opportunities and workplace culture during interviews, and maintaining professional networks that could provide honest assessments of organizational reputations. Most importantly, I stressed that accepting short-term compromises to gain professional experience was sometimes necessary, but that building skills and relationships that could support future transitions was essential for long-term career success. The conference presentation had been part of a broader effort to institutionalize the lessons learned from challenging workplace discrimination through educational programs, policy research, and advocacy training initiatives. Desert Advocacy Solutions had partnered with universities, professional organizations, and government agencies to develop comprehensive approaches to discrimination prevention that could be implemented across different industries and organizational contexts. The goal was to create systemic change that would make Bob Harrison's type of discriminatory behavior not just legally risky but culturally unacceptable and professionally counterproductive. The educational partnership with ASU had been particularly meaningful because it connected my advocacy work with the next generation of business leaders who would shape workplace cultures for decades to come. The curriculum we developed together included case studies, simulation exercises,
and practical training modules that taught students how to recognize discriminatory behavior, understand legal protections and reporting procedures, and develop leadership skills that could prevent discrimination and promote inclusive workplace cultures. The research component of our university partnership had produced academic publications and policy recommendations that were influencing federal compliance guidelines and industry best practices throughout the defense contracting sector. The data we'd collected from discrimination cases had revealed patterns and trends that were helping regulatory agencies understand how violations occurred and what prevention strategies were most effective. The research had also provided evidence for legislative proposals that could strengthen legal protections and improve enforcement mechanisms for addressing workplace discrimination. One of our most significant research findings had documented the ripple effects of discriminatory behavior on organizational performance and employee well-being. The study had tracked companies before and after implementing comprehensive discrimination prevention programs measuring changes in productivity, innovation metrics, employee satisfaction, and financial performance. The results demonstrated conclusively that investments in inclusive workplace cultures generated measurable returns that far exceeded the costs of training programs and policy implementation. The policy implications of our research had attracted attention from federal agencies responsible for overseeing government contractors and ensuring compliance with equal employment opportunity requirements. Desert Advocacy Solutions had been invited to participate in regulatory review processes and contribute expertise to policy development initiatives that could affect thousands of companies and millions of workers throughout the defense industry and beyond. The opportunity to influence policy at the federal level represented the kind of systemic impact that I'd hoped to achieve when establishing my consulting practice. My involvement in policy development had also created opportunities for collaboration with other advocacy organizations and civil rights groups that were working on related issues affecting workplace equality and economic justice. The partnerships had expanded my understanding of how discrimination intersected with other forms of social inequality while providing access to resources and expertise that enhanced the effectiveness of my own advocacy efforts. The collaborative approach had proven essential for addressing complex discrimination cases that required coordination between multiple organizations and regulatory agencies. The networking relationships I'd developed through policy work and academic partnerships had led to board positions with several national organizations focused on workplace equality and women's professional advancement. The board service provided platforms for influencing organizational strategies and resource allocation decisions while contributing expertise gained from frontline advocacy work. The positions also offered opportunities to mentor other advocates and share lessons learned from building successful consulting practices focused on social justice issues. David's career had continued to flourish in the positive environment at Meridian Tech Solutions, with his recent promotion to Director of Client Relations recognizing his technical expertise and leadership capabilities. The role provided him with authority over major contract negotiations and strategic planning initiatives that were shaping Meridian's future growth and market position. His success had validated our family's decision to challenge Bob Harrison's discriminatory behavior rather than accept it as an unchangeable aspect of workplace culture. The contrast between David's current professional satisfaction and his experience under Bob's management had reinforced our understanding of how toxic leadership can suppress talent and limit organizational potential. David's innovative approaches to client relationship management and project development had flourished under supportive leadership that valued his contributions rather than judging him based on irrelevant personal factors. His success had also created opportunities for him to mentor other employees and contribute to Meridian's efforts to maintain the inclusive workplace culture that had emerged following Bob's departure. Our children had grown into teenagers who understood the importance of standing up to unfair treatment and advocating for positive change in their own communities. Emma, now 13, had organized anti-bullying initiatives at her middle school and volunteered with local organizations supporting families affected by domestic violence. Jake, 11, had started a tutoring program for younger students who were struggling academically and needed additional support to succeed in challenging academic environments. The values Emma and Jake had absorbed from witnessing their parents' response to discrimination had influenced their own approaches to leadership and social responsibility in ways that made me proud of the legacy we were creating through our advocacy work. They understood that privilege came with responsibility to help others who were facing similar challenges, and they had developed confidence in their ability to create positive change through strategic action and principled persistence. The success of Desert Advocacy Solutions had created financial stability that allowed our family to pursue opportunities and experiences that wouldn't have been possible under our previous circumstances. The consulting practice generated revenue that exceeded what I'd earned during my corporate career while providing flexibility to prioritize family activities and community involvement. The financial independence had also enabled us to support charitable causes and advocacy organizations that aligned with our values and contributed to systemic social change. More importantly, the work had provided a sense of purpose and professional fulfillment that made every challenging case and difficult confrontation worthwhile. The discrimination survivors who had achieved justice through our advocacy efforts represented victories that extended far beyond individual case outcomes to demonstrate the possibility of challenging institutional unfairness and achieving meaningful reform. Each successful case had contributed to broader cultural change that made workplaces more equitable and opportunities more accessible for future generations. The 10th anniversary of Bob Harrison's termination had passed without fanfare, but the milestone provided an opportunity for reflection on the lasting impact of our decision to challenge his discriminatory behavior. The federal investigation that had ended his career had triggered changes at Meridian Tech Solutions that continued to influence company culture and management practices a decade later. The case had also established precedents for regulatory enforcement that had been applied to discrimination violations throughout the defense contracting industry. Bob himself had never recovered professionally from the federal investigation and termination, with his name appearing in regulatory databases and legal documents that made employment at government contractors impossible. His attempt to establish an independent consulting practice had failed due to reputation damage and lack of client confidence in his professional judgment and ethical standards. The consequences of his discriminatory behavior had proven to be permanent and career-ending, demonstrating the serious risks associated with violating workplace equality laws and professional standards. The contrast between Bob's professional destruction and our family's flourishing success had reinforced the lesson that discriminatory behavior ultimately undermines those who practice it while strengthening those who have the courage to challenge it. His assumption that insulting me would assert his dominance over David's career had backfired spectacularly, destroying his own professional prospects while launching our family toward achievements that exceeded anything we had previously imagined possible. As I prepared for another keynote presentation at a national conference on workplace equality, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had led from that humiliating anniversary dinner to a career focused on creating systemic change and empowering others to challenge discrimination. The woman Bob Harrison had dismissed as inappropriate for corporate culture had become someone whose expertise was sought by organizations throughout the country that wanted to build inclusive workplace environments and prevent costly discrimination violations. The transformation had required courage, persistence, and strategic thinking, but it had also depended on relationships, resources, and opportunities that might not have been available to everyone facing similar discrimination. My privileged position as someone with professional credentials, financial stability, and powerful connections had enabled me to challenge Bob's behavior effectively, but I remained aware that many discrimination survivors lacked similar advantages and needed additional support to achieve justice and create positive change. That awareness had shaped my commitment to pro bono work and advocacy training that could level the playing field for people facing discrimination without access to professional legal representation or strategic consultation. The goal was to democratize the tools and knowledge that had enabled my own successful challenge to discriminatory treatment while building networks of support that could sustain long-term advocacy efforts across diverse communities and organizational contexts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.